The crack of the whip echoed through the dusty main street of Redemption Creek, silencing the usual clamor of the frontier town as Rebecca Hawkins collapsed to her knees in the swirling dirt. The year was 1875, and the wild expanse of Wyoming territory had never felt more unforgiving than it did on this scorching summer day. Dust mingled with blood on Delilah Hayes' back as she struggled to breathe through the pain. Her crime had been defending a young Cheyenne boy from the drunken advances of the mayor's son, an act deemed inappropriate interference with civilized society by the town's corrupt officials. The sentence had been swift, 10 lashes in the town square for all to witness. "Let this be a lesson," Sheriff Bolton sneered, coiling the bloodied whip in his meaty hand. "Women would do well to remember their place in this town." Delilah's vision blurred as she tried to push herself up from the dirt. At 22, she'd seen her share of the world's cruelty, having traveled west from Boston after losing her parents to influenza 3 years prior. But nothing had prepared her for the savage brutality of frontier justice when wielded by corrupt men. From across the street, Jackson Yancy watched, his weathered hands gripping the hitching post so tightly his knuckles had gone white. The 30-year-old cowboy had ridden into town merely to resupply, before heading back to the Double Creek Ranch where he worked, but the public spectacle had frozen him in place like all the others. Unlike the others, however, Jackson could no longer stand by. As Sheriff Bolton raised the whip for one final, unauthorized stroke, Jackson launched himself forward. The sheriff's arm descended, but the lash never found its target. Jackson's body covered Delilah's, taking the cut across his own shoulder blade, the leather slicing through his cotton shirt. "That's enough," he growled, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent street. Bolton spat into the dust. "This ain't your concern, cowboy. Step aside." Jackson remained where he was, sheltering Delilah beneath him as he felt her trembling. "I said that's enough. She's taken her punishment." A grumble of agreement rippled through the gathering crowd. Even in the lawless territories, there were limits to what decent folk would tolerate. Sensing the shift in public sentiment, Bolton reluctantly backed away. "Get her out of my sight, then," he barked. "And you'd best remember whose town this is, Yancy." Jackson carefully gathered Delilah into his arms, mindful of her lacerated back. Her face was pale beneath the dust and tear streaks, her honey-brown hair falling in tangled waves around her shoulders. "You'll never be alone again," he whispered fiercely into her ear as he lifted her. "I promise you that." Delilah's green eyes fluttered open briefly, confusion and gratitude warring in their depths before she lost consciousness entirely. Jackson carried her to Doc Miller's office on the edge of town, kicking the door open with his boot. "Doc, need your help here, right quick." The elderly physician looked up from his desk, spectacles sliding down his nose. "Good God, what happened to the poor girl?" "Bolton happened," Jackson said grimly, carefully laying Delilah face down on the examination table. "Public whipping in the square." Doc Miller's face darkened as he immediately began gathering supplies. "That man will answer to a higher power someday. Strip her shirt away, son. I need to clean these wounds before infection sets in." Jackson hesitated, then gently cut away the shredded remnants of Delilah's blouse with Doc's scissors, leaving her back exposed. The angry red welts crisscrossed her otherwise smooth skin like a grotesque map. Jackson had to turn away, his stomach churning with rage. "She stood up for a Cheyenne boy," he explained, staring hard at the wall. "Jameson was drunk, roughing the kid up. She stepped between them." Doc Miller dabbed antiseptic onto the wounds, causing Delilah to moan softly in her unconscious state. "Sounds like Miss Hayes. She's been nothing but trouble for Bolton and his cronies since she arrived last year. God bless her. You know her. Everyone knows Delilah Hayes. Came west after her folks died, bought the old Harper place outside town, runs it alone, grows vegetables and raises chickens, trades fair with the Cheyenne. The doctor shook his head admiringly. Hardest working woman I've ever known and the kindest too. Jackson nodded slowly, pieces falling into place. He'd heard tell of the spinster farmer who lived alone and traded with Indians, but he'd never connected those stories with the beautiful woman now lying injured before him. She can't go back to her place, Doc said firmly. Not like this. Bolton won't let this lie, and she needs someone to tend these wounds for at least a week. Jackson didn't hesitate. I'll take her to Double Creek. My boss's wife will help. Martha Callahan's a good woman, Doc agreed, carefully applying bandages. But what about Bolton? He'll come looking. Let him come, Jackson said darkly. Double Creek is Callahan land. Sheriff's authority ends at the property line. As Doc finished his work and covered Delilah with a clean blanket, Jackson stepped outside to arrange transportation. He'd ridden into town on horseback, but Delilah couldn't possibly ride in her condition. Fortune smiled upon him when he spotted Henry Weber loading supplies into his wagon. "Henry," Jackson called, approaching the German immigrant. "I need a favor." Within the hour, Delilah was carefully settled in the back of Henry's wagon on a bed of clean straw and blankets. Still unconscious but stable, according to Doc Miller, who'd given Jackson a small bottle of laudanum for the pain and detailed instructions for cleaning her wounds. As they traveled the 15 miles to Double Creek Ranch, Jackson rode alongside, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. The rolling Wyoming landscape stretched endlessly under the vast blue sky, sagebrush and prairie grass rippling in the warm breeze. "The girl, she will be safe at Callahan's?" Henry asked as they crossed a shallow creek. "She will," Jackson assured him. "John and Martha Callahan are good people, just and fair." Henry nodded in approval. "Good. In this country, justice is, how you say, not always for everyone." Jackson couldn't argue with that truth. As a cowboy who'd spent the last decade drifting across the Western Territories, he'd seen enough injustice to last several lifetimes. Perhaps that was why he couldn't stand by and watch one more innocent person suffer. They arrived at Double Creek as the sun was beginning to set, the sprawling ranch house glowing amber in the fading light. Martha Callahan hurried onto the porch at the sound of approaching wheels, wiping her hands on her apron. "Jackson, we weren't expecting you back until—" Her words died as she saw the unconscious woman in the wagon. "Good heavens, what happened?" Jackson explained briefly as John Callahan emerged from the barn. The rancher's face grew grim as he listened to the account of Bolton's brutality. "Bring her inside," Martha commanded, already turning to prepare a room. "Poor child. John, send Billy for Dr. Pearson." "Doc Miller already treated her," Jackson said, carefully lifting Delilah from the wagon. "Said the wounds need cleaning and time to heal." Martha nodded briskly. "Then that's what she'll get. Bolton's been needing someone to stand up to him for years. Disgraceful, what he's done to that town." Within hours, Delilah was settled in the ranch's spare bedroom, her wounds freshly cleaned and dressed by Martha's capable hands. Jackson stood in the doorway, watching the older woman work with gentle efficiency. "You can stop hovering, Jackson," Martha said without looking up. "She'll be fine. I've nursed worse." "I know." Yet he couldn't seem to make himself leave. I feel responsible for her." Martha turned, studying him with knowing eyes. "Because you protected her. Because I didn't step in sooner." The admission came with a wave of shame. "I watched, Martha. I watched that first lash fall before I did anything." "And then you did something," Martha pointed out firmly. More than anyone else in that town. Now, go get some sleep. Tomorrow's still a workday, Cowboy." Reluctantly, Jackson retreated to the bunkhouse, though sleep proved elusive. The image of Delilah falling to the dirt, the sound of the whip cutting through air, these haunted him through the night. Morning brought a flurry of activity as ranch hands prepared for the day's work. Jackson had just saddled his horse when John Callahan approached. "Taking the day off, Jackson," he announced without preamble. "Need you to stay close to the house." "Sir?" John's weathered face was grim. "Got word from town. Bolton's asking questions about a missing woman and an interfering cowboy. Figure it's only a matter of time before he rides out here looking." Jackson nodded, understanding immediately. "You want me to stand guard?" "I want you to make yourself scarce if Bolton shows," John corrected. "No sense in provoking a confrontation, but yes, keep an eye on things. Martha's alone with the girl today." Throughout the morning, Jackson busied himself with repairs near the main house, keeping a watchful eye on the road from town. Around midday, Martha called him in for lunch and to help change Delilah's bandages. "She woke briefly," Martha informed him as they entered the spare bedroom. "Asked where she was. Seemed relieved when I mentioned your name." Delilah lay on her stomach, a sheet covering her to the shoulders. Her face was turned toward the window, eyes closed, breathing steady. In the daylight, Jackson could see the delicate curve of her profile, the sprinkle of freckles across her nose. "Miss Hayes," Martha said softly. "Jackson's here to help with your bandages." Delilah's eyes fluttered open, focusing slowly on Jackson's face. Recognition dawned, followed by a weak smile. "The cowboy who took the last lash," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Yes, madam," he replied, suddenly feeling awkward and rough-hewn in her presence despite her condition. "Jackson Yancy." "Thank you, Mr. Yancy." Her eyes held his for a moment before sliding closed again. "For what you did." Martha efficiently directed Jackson in helping to change the bandages. The angry red welts looked slightly better than the day before, though still shocking against Delilah's pale skin. Jackson tried to keep his touch clinical and respectful, but he couldn't help noticing the slender grace of her shoulders, the gentle curve of her spine. "The laudanum makes her drowsy," Martha explained as they finished. "But that's for the best right now. Sleep is what she needs most." As they left the room, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Jackson moved quickly to the window, cursing under his breath when he recognized Sheriff Bolton leading 3 men up the drive. "It's him," he told Martha grimly. "Take care of Miss Hayes. I'll handle this." Jackson stepped onto the front porch just as Bolton and his deputies dismounted. The sheriff's face twisted into an ugly smile when he spotted Jackson. "Well now, if it ain't the heroic cowboy," Bolton drawled, thumbs hooked in his gun belt. "Seems you've taken something that doesn't belong to you, Yancy." Jackson stood his ground, one hand resting casually near his holstered revolver. "Don't recall taking anything, Sheriff. Certainly nothing that belongs to you." "The Hayes woman," Bolton spat. "She's a criminal who hasn't completed her sentence. I've come to bring her back to town." "She's completed the sentence you declared publicly," Jackson replied evenly. 10 lashes. She took them all." Bolton's face darkened. "I decide when justice is served in Redemption Creek." "Not on Callahan land, you don't." John's voice rang out as he emerged from the barn, rifle in hand. Behind him stood 4 ranch hands similarly armed. "This is private property, Bolton. You have no authority here." The sheriff's gaze flicked between John's rifle and the determined faces of the ranch hands. Though he outranked them officially, he was outnumbered and outgunned. "The woman attacked my son," he insisted, though with less conviction. "She needs to answer for that." "From what I hear," John replied coldly, "your son was manhandling a child. Miss Hayes intervened as any decent person would. A tense silence stretched between the two groups until Bolton finally spat into the dust. "This ain't over," he warned, turning back to his horse. "The woman can't hide here forever." "No," Jackson agreed, "but she'll leave when she's good and ready, not before." They watched in grim silence as Bolton and his men rode away. Only when they were specks on the horizon did John lower his rifle. "He'll be back," the rancher predicted. "Man like that doesn't let go of a grudge easily." Jackson nodded, already forming a plan in his mind. "Then we need to make sure Miss Hayes is somewhere else when he returns." Over the next 3 days, Delilah's condition improved steadily under Martha's care. By the 4th day, she was able to sit up and take meals at the table, though movement still caused her considerable pain. Jackson found himself seeking reasons to be near the house, taking on repair tasks that could have waited, just to exchange a few words with her. He learned that she had indeed come west following her parents' deaths, determined to make a new life for herself rather than marry the much older businessman her uncle had selected. With her modest inheritance, she'd purchased the small farm outside Redemption Creek and taught herself to grow crops and raise chickens. "It's not much," she told Jackson as they sat on the porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "But it's mine. The first thing that's ever truly been mine alone." "It's a fine thing having a place of your own," Jackson agreed, thinking of all the years he'd drifted from ranch to ranch, never putting down roots. Delilah turned to him, studying his face in the fading light. "What about you, Mr. Yancy? What brought you to Wyoming?" Jackson smiled ruefully. "The same thing that's brought me everywhere else: work and open country. Been cowboying since I was 16. Texas, Colorado, Montana, now here." "No family?" she asked softly. "Lost my folks in the war. Been on my own since." Delilah nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Then we have that in common." As they sat in companionable silence, Martha stepped onto the porch. "Letter from town," she announced, handing a folded paper to Delilah. "Henry Weber brought it when he delivered supplies." Delilah unfolded the letter, her expression growing increasingly troubled as she read. "My farm," she said finally, looking up with worried eyes. "Sheriff Bolton's declared it abandoned and is putting it up for auction next week." Martha made a sound of outrage. "He can't do that." "You've only been gone a week. Legally, he probably can," Jackson said grimly. "Especially if no one's there to dispute it." "I have to go back," Delilah declared, struggling to her feet. "That farm is all I have. I won't let him take it." "You can't," Jackson protested, rising with her. "Bolton's just looking for an excuse to arrest you or worse." "What choice do I have?" she demanded, her green eyes flashing with determination. "Stay here forever? Hide while everything I've worked for is stolen from me?" John joined them on the porch, having overheard the conversation. "She's right, Jackson. She can't abandon her property." "Then I'm going with her," Jackson stated firmly. "It wasn't a request or an offer, it was a declaration." Delilah shook her head. "I can't ask that of you. You've already risked enough on my behalf." "You're not asking, I'm telling." His voice softened. "Besides, I've been meaning to quit cowboying anyway, thinking of settling down somewhere." The look that passed between them held more meaning than either was ready to acknowledge. John cleared his throat. "If you're serious about this, Jackson, you'll need a plan. Bolton won't just let you waltz back into town." Through the night, they formulated their strategy. The key element was timing. They needed to return to Redemption Creek just before the auction, giving Bolton minimal opportunity to interfere. They also needed witnesses, respectable citizens who would attest to Delilah's legitimate ownership of the property. 2 days later, Jackson and Delilah set out for town in a borrowed wagon. Her back was healing well, though the deeper lashes would leave permanent scars. They traveled slowly to minimize her discomfort, making camp well off the main trail as evening approached. As Jackson built a small fire, Delilah sat wrapped in a blanket, watching him work. "Why are you doing this?" she asked suddenly. "Truly, you barely know me." Jackson considered the question as he arranged kindling. "Maybe I'm tired of seeing good people suffer while men like Bolton prosper," he said finally. "Or maybe I recognize something in you that reminds me of what I want to be." "And what's that?" "Brave. Principled." He met her gaze across the growing flames. "Free." That night, as they sat beside the fire sharing a simple meal, Jackson found himself telling Delilah things he'd never told another soul about the horrors he'd witnessed during his years drifting, the loneliness of the trail, and his growing desire for something more permanent than the next season's wage. In turn, Delilah spoke of her dreams for her small farm, her friendship with the nearby Cheyenne, and her refusal to bow to the town's expectations of proper female behavior. "They call me peculiar," she said with a small laugh. "A spinster at 22, working the land alone, trading with Indians." "I'd call you remarkable," Jackson replied honestly. In the flickering firelight, something shifted between them, a recognition of kindred spirits, of shared values despite their different paths. When Delilah shivered slightly in the cool night air, Jackson moved to sit beside her, offering his warmth without presumption. "Thank you," she murmured, leaning slightly against his shoulder. "Not just for the warmth, for everything." They arrived on the outskirts of Redemption Creek, shortly before noon the following day, timing their entry to coincide with the scheduled auction at 2 o'clock. Rather than entering town directly, they stopped at the home of Judge Wilford Peterson, an honest man known for his fair dealings with all citizens, regardless of status. The judge listened gravely to their story, examining Delilah's deed and tax receipts. "Bolton's overstepped his authority," he concluded. "Again, but challenging him publicly is dangerous." "We're not looking to challenge him," Jackson explained. "Just to stop the auction and get Miss Hayes safely back to her property." Judge Peterson nodded thoughtfully. "I can declare the auction invalid on legal grounds. Bolton won't like it, but he won't openly defy my authority, not with witnesses present." With the judge's support secured, they proceeded to the town square where a small crowd had gathered for the auction. Sheriff Bolton stood on the steps of the town hall, preparing to begin the proceedings. His face darkened dangerously when he spotted Delilah and Jackson approaching alongside the judge. "This auction is canceled," Judge Peterson announced loudly, his authoritative voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "Miss Hayes has presented valid proof of ownership and timely payment of all taxes. There are no legal grounds for seizure of her property." Bolton's hand moved toward his gun. "The woman's a criminal. She has no right to own property in this town." "She's served the sentence you imposed," the judge countered firmly. "Her debt to the law is paid. Any further action against her would constitute harassment, Sheriff." A tense standoff ensued, the townspeople watching with bated breath as Bolton weighed his options. Jackson positioned himself slightly ahead of Delilah, ready to protect her if necessary. Finally, Mayor Harris stepped forward, clearly recognizing the potential disaster unfolding. "The judge is right, Bolton. Let it go." With a murderous glare, Bolton backed down. "Fine, the auction is canceled, but this ain't over." As the crowd dispersed, Jackson and Delilah thanked Judge Peterson for his intervention. "Be careful," the judge warned. "Bolton's pride is wounded. That makes him more dangerous than ever." They headed directly to Delilah's farm, a modest homestead on the outskirts of town. The small cabin appeared untouched, though the garden had suffered from neglect during her absence. To their surprise, they found Delilah's chickens healthy and well-fed. "Merry Littlefeather," Delilah explained, spotting signs of the Cheyenne woman's care. She must have been looking after them. Inside the cabin, everything was as Delilah had left it, though a fine layer of dust covered the simple furnishings. She moved through the space, touching objects as if reassuring herself that everything was still real. "It's not much," she said, echoing her earlier words to Jackson, "but it's home." Jackson stood in the doorway, suddenly uncertain of his place. "I should probably find somewhere in town to stay tonight. Make sure Bolton doesn't try anything." Delilah turned to him, a mix of emotions playing across her face. "Or you could stay here. I have a spare pallet." The invitation hung between them, weighted with unspoken meaning. Jackson cleared his throat. "That wouldn't be proper, Miss Hayes." A small smile curved her lips. "I think we're well past concerns about propriety, Mr. Yancy. Besides, I'd feel safer with you here." That night, Jackson slept on a pallet near the door while Delilah took her bed on the other side of the single-room cabin. Though physically exhausted, he found sleep elusive, acutely aware of her presence just a few yards away. The next morning brought a return to normalcy as Delilah tended her chickens and assessed the state of her garden. Jackson made himself useful repairing a loose section of fencing and checking the perimeter of her small property. "What will you do now?" Delilah asked as they shared lunch in the shade of a large oak tree. Jackson considered the question. "Find work, I suppose. There must be ranches nearby hiring." Delilah hesitated. "Or you could stay here. I can't pay much, but I could use the help getting the garden back in shape. And—" She looked away. "It would be nice not to be alone." The offer stunned him. "You'd trust me to stay, a man you barely know." "A man who took a whiplash meant for me," she corrected softly. "A man who carried me to safety and protected me from harm. I think I know enough, Jackson Yancy." And so Jackson stayed, helping Delilah rebuild what neglect had damaged and expand what was already thriving. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. They settled into a comfortable routine, working side by side during the day and sharing stories by the fire in the evenings. Bolton remained a threat, occasionally riding past the property with meaningful glares, but he never directly confronted them. The support of Judge Peterson and the growing respect of the townspeople provided a measure of protection that even the corrupt sheriff hesitated to challenge. As autumn painted the Wyoming landscape in brilliant hues of gold and crimson, Jackson built a small cabin for himself on the edge of Delilah's property. Though propriety demanded separate dwellings, they both knew it was merely a formality. Their lives had become inexorably intertwined, their partnership extending far beyond mere convenience. One crisp October evening, as they walked the perimeter of the thriving farm, Delilah stopped suddenly beneath a towering cottonwood tree. "I never properly thanked you," she said, turning to face Jackson, "for that day in town, for everything since." Jackson shook his head. "There's no need, there is," she insisted, stepping closer. "You said I would never be alone again. Did you mean that?" The question hung between them, laden with possibility. Jackson reached out slowly, brushing a strand of honey-brown hair from her face. "I meant it then," he said softly. "I mean it even more now." Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question and an answer all at once. When they parted, Delilah's green eyes shone with certainty. "I love you, Jackson Yancy," she whispered. "I think I have since the moment you shielded me from that whip." "And I love you, Delilah Hayes," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "More than I thought possible." They were married by Judge Peterson 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony attended by their growing circle of friends. Martha and John Callahan made the journey from Double Creek Ranch, bringing with them a fine young milk cow as a wedding gift. Even several members of the nearby Cheyenne came to celebrate, their presence a testament to Delilah's respectful friendship. Sheriff Bolton left Redemption Creek that winter, driven out by a combination of mounting corruption scandals and the election of a new mayor committed to reform. His departure removed the last shadow from Delilah and Jackson's happiness. Spring brought new beginnings as they expanded the farm, adding cattle and horses to their growing enterprise. By summer, they had hired 2 young men to help with the increasing workload, and Delilah had news of her own to share. "A baby," Jackson repeated in wonder when she told him, his hand gently resting on her still flat stomach. "Our baby." "Due in winter," Delilah confirmed, her face glowing with joy. "Our own family, Jackson, something neither of us thought we'd have again." As the sun set over their flourishing homestead, Jackson held Delilah close, marveling at how a single act of courage had changed the course of both their lives. From the moment he had covered her fallen body with his own, promising she would never be alone, their destinies had been joined not by the cruelty that had brought them together, but by the love that had grown in its aftermath. In the wild and often unforgiving expanse of the Wyoming territory, they had found in each other not just partnership and passion, but a true home, one built on shared values, mutual respect, and a love strong enough to withstand whatever challenges the frontier might bring.